Hello, my name is Sydney Larrabee, and the topic that I chose to write my research paper on was the threat of sea level rise. Sea level rise is one of the many ways that global warming is taking place on Earth, and it is happening right in front of us. This video will educate you on what sea level rise is, how it is taking place, how researchers measure it as well as their findings, what is expected to happen to human life and the planet if sea levels rise too much, and methods that we take part in to prepare for what is to come. Now, knowing what sea level rise is pretty straightforward, but to sum up quickly, sea level rise is when the water sources throughout the world, usually the ocean and sometimes including lakes and rivers, have more water added to them, thus causing them to rise. It is one of the many ways that global warming is taking place. The reason why global warming plays such a huge role in sea level rise is because, as explained by one of the articles I read called Climate Change Global Sea Level by Rebecca Lindsay, is that global warming is causing many ice sheets and glaciers to melt as well as thermal expansion. Once again, the melting of glaciers and ice sheets are pretty self-explanatory for the reason why they would be adding more water to the sea, but thermal expansion may not be that well known. That is when the greenhouse gases stored in the water continue to stay in the water rather than going up into the atmosphere. And when that happens, it begins to warm up the water. When warmed up, it begins to expand, thus causing sea levels to rise. With the basics out of the way, that leads us to break down those explanations further in order to see why it is such a threat. Now, when some people see how much is expected for sea levels to rise, the common mistake that comes with that is to them, it's really not that much. For example, let's say that sea levels are supposed to rise at least a foot within the next few years. To some, a foot might not seem that much when looked at it in terms of distance, but for sea level rise, that's a lot. Referring back to the article I just mentioned, the author then goes into detail about how the amount of rise has begun to get higher and higher with each decade, thus putting it into a clear perspective. One piece of information that Lindsay shared comes from the World Glacier Monitoring Services, which revealed that the amount that the sea level rose due to the melting of ice sheets was, quote, 6.7 inches in the 1980s, 18 in the 1990s, 20 in the 2000s, and 33 between 2010 and 2018. It gradually grew more and is expected to grow more in the future. Now, I'm going to put this into a little bit more of a clear perspective by demonstrating this with a measuring tape. As I said, some people may not actually realize how much water that actually is, because sure, this is a foot, and really, it's not that big when you think about it, but in terms of water, yeah, that's quite a lot. So, let's see, the first measurement said was 6.7 inches, which is roughly about here. Okay. Yeah, that's not really so bad, not that much of a big deal. But then 10 years later, it grew to 18 inches, which then puts it to here. This is where it originally was, and then it went up to here. 10 years later, it grew another 2 inches, which isn't really that much, but it's here. Still pretty good size. And then finally, within 8 years, it went up 33, which goes to here. As you can tell, this is much bigger than all the other measurements because it goes off the screen, thus concluding that yes, that is a lot of water. Lindsay then takes us even further by bringing up how many tons are lost per year from the ice sheets in Greenland. She says that between the years of 1992 and 2001, quote, 34 tons, end quote, have been lost. It then took a sudden spike up to, quote, 247 billion tons per year, end quote, for the years of 2012 to 2016. She then directs her attention to the ice sheets in Antarctica. And following the same years, Lindsay states that it has, quote, nearly quadrupled from 51 billion tons per year to 199 billion tons per year, end quote. Following this information, this clearly shows that these ice sheets are melting, and they are melting fast. With that, the information also shows that even though the numbers can be seen as small, but when actually put to scale, it's large. Later on in the video, I will explain why these numbers should be taken more seriously. From the information given, it is easy to see that the glaciers and ice sheets are melting quickly, and NASA has done countless research to support this. In an article written by them called "New Study Finds Sea Level Rise Accelerating," the overall point of it is to discuss how the levels are rising at a much faster rate than what is to be expected. They bring up the melting of the glaciers and ice sheets as well as thermal expansion. A new statistic mentioned is, quote, "The ocean has contributed about half of the 2.8 inches, 7 centimeters, of global mean sea level rise we've seen over the past 25 years, end quote. After that, it is then explained how they take measurements. Measurements can be taken in multiple ways, but the method most favored is sending up satellites that record the data. There are multiple that are sent up, coming from groups such as NASA and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, but out of all of them, the one that seems to get the most accurate readings is the Topex Poseidon-Jason satellite. It is said that it, quote, provides sea surface height information every 10 days for over 25 years, end quote, as well as gathering, quote, nearly 500,000 accurate tide gauges, end quote. Despite the satellite collecting such accurate data, that does not mean that researchers themselves don't get involved. The article then goes on to say that researchers need to take in events such as El Nino and how that can affect sea level rise as well. Now that it's apparent that sea level rise is happening and that it's happening fast, a concern that arises is what is expected to come next. Researchers have to make predictions off of the information that they have gathered. David Wallace Wells, author of the book The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming, brings up some of the predictions. In the chapter about sea level rise, he first states that it is expected to rise 6 to 8 feet, and that can easily be followed by extreme flooding. He then references another work called The Water Will Come, Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and the Remaking of the Civilized World by Jeff Godell, who explains that most structures we know today will eventually be underwater. Some of the structures mentioned are the Kennedy Space Center and the Marshall Islands. With the threat of such flooding, this also puts cities, as well as their farmland and power plants, at risk. There are options that these cities can take to protect themselves, which will be discussed more in depth later, but some methods may only work for so long. It is highly recommended that these cities relocate further inland, and if they're going to, it is best that they do it sooner than later. Moving an entire city is not an over-the-night job, so it is best to keep an eye on the information about sea level rise and begin to prepare for the move rather than waiting until it's in effect and moving too late. Wells then reveals more information about the melting of the ice sheets that supports points mentioned earlier. When discussing the ice sheets in Antarctica, he makes it easy to envision by the fact that he shares. He reveals that the amount of ice melting from these ice sheets per year is, quote, enough to cover New Jersey in 3 feet of ice, end quote. He then goes further by including more ice sheets located within the area. To put it in short, it is said that if both of these ice sheets were to melt completely, it, end quote, could raise sea level by 200 feet, end quote. Despite sharing this, nothing is ever mentioned on how large these ice sheets are, how much is left, and so on, so it can't be determined if this will either include the 6 to 8 feet that is already expected, or if this will add more onto the number. Whatever the case, it is still drastic. Of course, even though there are countless pieces of evidence to prove that sea level rise is happening and will cause extreme damage, some people are still skeptical. One of the reasons is that they want to make sure that they are getting their information from an accurate source, which is, of course, a very valid reason. With all the information I have already shared, this can easily be backed up by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, otherwise known as the IPCC. They are extremely reliable when it comes to all things related to climate change. In one of their reports titled Sea Level Rise and Implications for Low-Lying Islands, Coasts and Communities, many of the risks mentioned are supposed to either have already happened or will happen by 2100, and some of those include, quote, permanent submergence of land by mean sea levels or mean high tides, more frequent or intense flooding, and loss and change of ecosystems, end quote. The introduction alone reveals that what is going to come should not be happening, saying, quote, ESL, which is extreme sea level, events that are historically rare will become common by 2100 under all emission scenarios, end quote. The IPCC also shares ways that sea level rise will not only affect Earth, but human life as well. It was mentioned previously that cities will have to relocate further inland, which still holds true, but in other ways the IPCC says it will affect human life is through gender inequality and loss of indigenous and local knowledge. To begin, I will explain why gender inequality plays a role in sea level rise. It is known that in developing countries, women are not treated as equal as men, which is what the report mentions. It then brings up Bangladesh in particular and how the women there already struggle to make decisions regarding their household and community, and that also includes not getting access to information about the climate. Climate change does not only target one group of people, but all, so therefore, everyone should get access to it. For indigenous and local knowledge, the IPCC explains that this is, quote, key to determining how people recognize and respond to environmental risk, end quote. To explain further, this also includes how they protect their environment and what they should be doing with their resources. If sea levels continue to rise, it is said that it will, quote, increase long-term vulnerability, end quote. When it gets to that state, people will begin to lose touch with their environment and can cause them not to properly take care of it or protect it. It needs to stay together so both people and the environment are safe. Despite all this research done to show that sea level rise is happening, there has also been research to show the possibility that it may not be happening to the severity that we believe. This research comes from two glaciologists, Robert DeCanto and David Pollard, who are the focus from the Atlantic article titled The Terrifying Sea Level Prediction Now Looks Far Less Likely by Robinson Meyer. In it, it begins by saying that DeCanto and Pollard wrote a paper that stated that the glaciers in Antarctica were melting at a much faster rate than what they were expecting. However, as they continued to look into this further with other glaciologists, their stance ended up changing. They looked back at the information they had gathered and realized that the glaciers were actually more stable than previously believed. Of course, this stance still supports the fact that sea level rise is a threat and will reach a point where it will cause significant damage, but this new information may give us more time to prepare for it. Their final stance on it is that, quote, Antarctica may only contribute about a foot of sea level rise by 2100, end quote, than what I mentioned previously, which was roughly 6 to 8 feet. Now that you have a better understanding of sea level rise, you may be wondering if there is anything you can do to help give us more time to repair or lessen the damage. In reality, that can't easily be done since it is being caused by global warming, but there are ways that people themselves and their community can help. The website sealevelrise.org has a page that lists solutions, and they break it up into 3 main sections: individual, local, and state and federal. We will begin with individual. In it, ways that it can be done individually is to be educated on sea level rise and know what is going on in regards to it. Being educated on it can help someone come to decisions such as getting flood insurance, elevating their homes, or relocating to somewhere safer. As for local, it focuses on the community and it basically follows the same pattern, but takes it a step further. It acknowledges that anything done to a community would take time, so they must keep an eye on information being released about sea level rise as they make decisions. These decisions, such as building walls around the city, elevating streets, or relocating the entire city itself, should be done sooner than later. Finally, state and federal is taking it to the highest level and getting government involved. The main point stated is, quote, increasing funds for local infrastructure, end quote. Other than taking time, projects to help fight against sea level rise cost money, and there needs to be some put aside to focus on those projects. Another main point with that is that the state needs to start paying more attention to sea level rise and, quote, consider the risk of flooding in their plans, end quote. Getting it to this point and having it be taken seriously can be a challenge, but with enough people educated and having it done sooner than later, there is a possibility. In conclusion, the threat of sea level rise is real and cannot be ignored any longer. Though it may not be happening at the rate that we may have previously believed, the glaciers and ice sheets are still melting rapidly. However, the only true way to properly stop it is to tackle global warming itself, but that doesn't come easy. Until then, there are still methods we can do individually and as a community to prepare ourselves for it. It is only a matter of time until we're consumed by water, and we need to start acting now.